September 17, 1944. The South China Sea, 600 miles southeast of Hong Kong. The tropical night was a blanket of oppressive heat and absolute blackness, save for the sickly green glow emanating from the gauges in the control room of the USS Barb, SS-220. The air, thick with the smell of sweat, oil, and ozone, hummed with a tension that was less about fear and more about the anticipation of violence. Above, the sea was calm, a perfect, deceptive mirror for the moonless sky. Below, at 60 feet, Barb glided, a 311-foot-long, 1,526-ton iron predator. Her crew motionless, listening. Commander Eugene B. Fluckey, a man whose intense focus seemed to compress time and space within the tight confines of the submarine, stood at the periscope well. His face, illuminated briefly by the instrument's rising light, was sharp and devoid of emotion. He was the most successful American submarine commander of the war, a legend known to his men simply as Lucky Fluckey, though luck rarely had much to do with the meticulous planning and relentless aggression that defined his patrols. This was Barb's 10th war patrol, and Fluckey had brought her deep into the enemy's heartland, the crucial maritime arteries of the South China Sea. He was hunting for a convoy, a prize worthy of his boat's reputation. For days, they had been operating on pure intelligence and gut instinct. The Japanese shipping lanes here were heavily guarded, considered too dangerous for prolonged patrols by many commanders. But Fluckey thrived on the danger. He raised the attack periscope slowly, silently, rotating the heavy brass and glass mechanism until his eye was pressed against the rubber cup. Bearing 040 range looks like 8,000 yards. Mastheads. Multiple, Fluckey murmured, his voice low and steady. The whisper was immediately repeated throughout the boat by the watch officer, Lieutenant Commander James C. Reiner, and the attack team. The men in the torpedo room stiffened, their hands hovering over the firing mechanisms of the Mark 14 torpedoes nestled in the tubes. They knew the drill. They knew the stakes. The silhouette in the crosshairs resolved into three distinct shapes. A pair of escorts flanking a massive vessel, a clear indication of a high-value target. Fluckey tracked them for another minute, calculating speed, course, and zigzag pattern. "That's a carrier," he stated, a note of grim satisfaction entering his tone. The target was the Unyo, a light escort carrier, vital to the Japanese efforts to ferry aircraft and supplies through these contested waters. Sinking a carrier, even an escort carrier, was a monumental blow. Barb began her intricate dance of approach. Fluckey ordered the boat shallower, to 45 feet, and increased speed slightly. The electric motors whined softly, the sound barely perceptible over the rhythmic ticking of the attack plotter. The tension in the control room was palpable. Every man held his breath, fearing the smallest noise might betray their presence to the Japanese sonar operators above. The range closed rapidly. 5,000 yards, 3,000 yards. Fluckey's targeting solution was tightening with every second. The enemy escorts, arrogant in their home territory, seemed to be relying more on a standard screen than an aggressive sweep. Final bearing and range on the escort carrier. Target angle 90. Set spread for 6 torpedoes. Contact detonators. Fire control, report ready, Fluckey commanded. The range was now agonizingly close, just 1,200 yards. Too close for comfort, but perfect for a kill. The gunner's mate, his eyes glued to the bubble in the tilt indicator, confirmed the trim. "All green, sir. Ready to fire." Fluckey took one last, long look through the periscope. The Unyo was broadside a magnificent, vulnerable target. He had them. Fire 1. Fire 2. Fire 3. The commands ripped through the silence of Barb's control room. With each order, a sharp thwump echoed through the hull as compressed air ejected a Mark 14 torpedo from its tube. The sound was instantly followed by the rushing hiss of water being cycled to compensate for the sudden loss of weight. The boat momentarily surged upwards, but the seasoned crew quickly stabilized the trim. The torpedoes, deadly steel cigars packed with Torpex explosive, sped away toward the silhouette of the Japanese carrier. Fluckey counted the seconds, his gaze locked on the periscope view. watching the black water for signs of the enemy escorts reacting to the faint cavitation noise generated by the outgoing weapons. The 6 torpedoes were running hot, straight, and true. They were programmed to impact the Unyo amidships, designed to break her back. The time of flight seemed eternal, every passing second stretching the nerves of the men below. The torpedoes were running shallow, aiming for the waterline, maximizing the force of the blast. The Japanese vessel, cruising steadily at about 15 knots, sailed unknowingly toward disaster. Impact in 5-4. Then, the ocean erupted. A terrifying, concussive boom hammered Barb's hull, followed immediately by another, and then a third. The force of the detonation, even filtered through the deep water, was enough to violently shake the submarine, causing unsecured gear to clatter and swing. Water poured down the periscope well. Fluckey, gripping the handles of the scope, shouted, "For hits! For positive hits! Excellent work, men!" The triumphant cheer that momentarily broke the professional discipline in the control room was quickly stifled by the urgent need for evasion. Through the periscope, the scene was one of catastrophic destruction. Massive plumes of white steam and black smoke surged hundreds of feet into the air from the carrier's side. The Unyo, instantly crippled, was listing heavily to starboard, her forward momentum already slowing. Secondary explosions began to bloom within her structure, a sign that aviation fuel or ordnance stores had been breached. The Japanese crew was running wildly across the listing flight deck, tiny figures silhouetted against the flames that began licking up from the hangar bay. The escorts, finally alerted by the massive explosions, wheeled around aggressively. The destroyer screening on the Unyo's port side began closing the distance, its bow wave clearly visible in the periscope. Fluckey slammed the handles down. "Take her deep. All ahead flank. Rig for silent running." The submarine dove sharply, the depth gauge needle sweeping past 100 feet. The control room became a frantic hub of men executing orders, their motions sharp and practiced. They knew what was coming. The destroyer was now directly overhead, its screws hammering the water with an intimidating rhythm. Then came the unmistakable sound of pinging sonar, sweeping the water for the American intruder. The high-pitched ping-ping-ping reverberated through Barb's steel hull, sounding like a death knell. "Depth charges away," the acoustic man reported, his voice high with adrenaline. The first explosions were distant, perhaps 1,000 yards away, but they were growing closer. The Japanese were bracket shooting, a technique designed to walk the charges right onto the submerged submarine. The next charges, 5 in quick succession, exploded terrifyingly close. The boat shuddered violently, light bulbs flickered out, and small streams of water began to weep from the joints in the forward torpedo tubes. The blast threw men off their feet. Fluckey, steadying himself, ordered a drastic change in depth and course, utilizing the underwater acoustic shadows cast by the deep thermal layers to conceal their escape. This brutal, terrifying game of cat and mouse continued for the next 3 agonizing hours, but Fluckey's mastery of evasion, coupled with the Japanese focus on the already sinking Unyo, eventually allowed Barb to slip away into the deep anonymity of the South China Sea. The Unyo, engulfed in fire, was confirmed to be sinking. The carrier would soon be gone. Having successfully shaken off the persistent Japanese escorts, Commander Fluckey brought Barb back up to periscope depth hours later, ensuring they were well clear of the sinking Unyo's immediate area. The mission objective had been accomplished. The carrier was destroyed, a major naval asset gone. Barb continued her patrol, the crew recovering from the high-stress evasion, maintaining the relentless vigilance that defined the U.S. submarine service in the Pacific. They were searching for the next target, pressing deeper into enemy waters, as they had done on countless patrols before. But 2 days later, on September 19th, their routine patrols were shattered by a chance encounter with the debris of a far more tragic event. Cruising near the waters of the Palawan Passage, the watch officer spotted a vast, sprawling field of wreckage littering the ocean surface. It wasn't the debris of a naval battle. It was the sad detritus of a transport ship, pieces of splintered wood, personal effects, and floating crates, mixed with a sickening density of bodies. Fluckey brought Barb closer, recognizing the grim reality. They had stumbled upon the aftermath of a hell ship sinking. Japanese transport ships, often unmarked and carrying thousands of Allied prisoners of war, POWs, in horrific conditions, were legitimate military targets. However, American submariners lived with a constant, terrible knowledge that many of the ships they torpedoed held Allied prisoners below decks. The sheer volume and nature of the wreckage suggested a huge loss of life. Among the floating debris were identifiable items: Australian uniform fragments and British-issued gear, a horrifying confirmation of the cargo. Fluckey ordered the boat to approach cautiously. The area was still dangerous, but the submarine's mission temporarily shifted from aggression to humanitarian reconnaissance. They spent an hour slowly traversing the wreckage field, scanning for any sign of life. Many of the bodies were weighted down by oil and exposure, victims of a rapid, brutal sinking. The sight weighed heavily on the crew, a stark, silent reminder of the war's cold cost. Then, the lookouts reported an anomaly, movement. Near a large piece of floating deck plating, a shape detached itself from the debris. It was a group of men, clinging desperately to the wreckage, clearly alive but exhausted and critically exposed. Fluckey immediately ordered Barb to surface, a high-risk decision in these hostile waters, but one that was non-negotiable given the circumstances. He was risking his boat and crew for men who were already considered lost to the war. As Barb rose to the surface, the diesel engines roared to life, replacing the silent hum of the batteries. The hatch was thrown open, and the bridge crew scrambled onto the wet deck. Fluckey, armed, looked out across the scene. The survivors, there appeared to be about a dozen, were clinging to the flotsam of what was later identified as the SS Rakuyo Maru. This ship had been torpedoed by another American submarine, the USS on September 12th, for days before Barb's attack on Unyo. For over a week, these men had endured the unforgiving ocean. The men in the water were skeletal, coated in thick oil, and barely able to wave. Fluckey immediately dispatched a rescue team, led by Lieutenant James C. Reiner, consisting of 4 armed sailors in the rubber raft. They paddled toward the floating wreckage, navigating the dangerous currents and the scattered debris. The rescue was painstaking and fraught with peril. The survivors, mostly Australian and British POWs, were too weak to climb into the raft without assistance. The American sailors had to physically pull the oil-slicked, barely conscious men from the sea, one by one. The process of pulling the surviving men aboard the USS Barb was agonizingly slow. The British and Australian POWs, subjects of the Rakuyo Maru tragedy, were in a state of advanced shock, dehydration, and severe exposure. Many were too weak to hold onto the lines thrown to them. The rescue team in the rubber boat worked with urgent efficiency, battling the gentle but relentless swell and the slick oil that coated everything. For the men still clinging to the wreckage, this unexpected arrival of an American submarine was the definitive line between life and a cold, anonymous death. One by one, they were brought back to the submarine. As each man was hauled onto the deck of Barb, he represented a victory over the terrible circumstances. The American crew, hardened combat veterans, treated the emaciated and traumatized survivors with immediate, profound compassion. They were rushed below deck, stripped of their oil-soaked rags, and wrapped in warm blankets. The pharmacist's mate immediately began administering first aid, giving small sips of water and concentrated rations to prevent overwhelming their weakened digestive systems. In total, 14 Allied POWs, a mix of Australian and British personnel, were successfully brought aboard the Barb. Commander Fluckey knew the area was a ticking time bomb. The presence of a surface submarine and the floating debris field meant that Japanese patrol aircraft or surface ships could appear at any moment. He couldn't stay. However, just as they were preparing to dive, the crew realized the enormity of the sinking. They had rescued 14 men, but the wreck site suggested hundreds, perhaps thousands, more had been aboard the Rakuyo Maru. The Japanese had not waited for survivors. The POWs had been left to the sea. Fluckey had to make an impossible choice. He was already deep in enemy territory, running low on battery power for silent evasion. And now he carried 14 non-combatants who required urgent medical attention. To stay and search further would almost certainly guarantee the loss of his boat and his entire crew. His primary mission was to sink ships and return his command safely to port. With a heavy heart, Fluckey gave the order to submerge. Clear the bridge. All hands below. Rig for a dive. The sub slipped beneath the waves, abandoning the vast, tragic field of wreckage and the hundreds of other men who still desperately clung to life. It was a calculated, painful necessity. The rescue of the 14 was a miracle. Risking everything for more was a fool's errand. The contrast between the adrenaline-charged sinking of the Unyo and the grim, emotionally draining rescue days later highlighted the multifaceted brutality of the submarine war. They had dealt death, and now they had given life, all within a few days in the same hostile waters. Below, as Barb dove, the control room was a scene of controlled chaos, with the new, weak occupants being settled in every available space. The survivors were initially dazed, unable to comprehend their salvation. Many had been floating for over a week, facing certain death. Their rescue was the final, indelible feature of a patrol that had already secured legendary status, with the sinking of a carrier. But Barb's story, and the patrol's incredible record, was built on more than just a single engagement. It was built on a persistent, almost unbelievable streak of success and survival that defined Commander Fluckey's command. The journey out of the South China Sea with 14 critically ill survivors aboard was as demanding as any combat engagement. Commander Fluckey employed every ounce of his tactical cunning to navigate Barb safely through the heavily patrolled waters. The routine of the boat was adapted entirely to the needs of the rescued POWs. The crew shared their limited rations, carefully portioned to coax the oil-poisoned stomachs of the Australians and Britons back to health. The American submariners, normally reserved and intensely focused, performed nursing duties, providing constant vigilance against fevers and infections, a testament to the common bond of military service. As Barb finally turned eastward, heading for the safety of the Allied base at Fremantle, Australia, the success of the patrol began to sink in. The sinking of the escort carrier Unyo on September 17th was a crippling blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy's transport capability. But this was merely the jewel in a much larger crown. Under Fluckey's command, USS Barb compiled one of the most outstanding combat records of World War II silent service. The numbers spoke for themselves, starkly delineating the relentless efficiency of the boat and its commander. Across only 12 grueling war patrols, Barb sank an astonishing 17 ships, totaling a certified 96,628 tons of enemy shipping. This tonnage figure placed Barb among the top-ranking submarines of the entire war. What made Barb's record truly legendary, however, was not just the sheer tonnage destroyed, but the cost to her own crew. Through all the depth charge attacks, the close-quarters surface engagements, and the daring maneuvers deep in enemy harbors, including Fluckey's famous raid on Sherry Carafuto, where he sent a shore party to blow up a train, Barb returned home every single time with 0 crew casualties. Every man who started a patrol with Fluckey finished it. This perfect safety record, combined with the unparalleled destruction they wrought, solidified Fluckey's status as a genius of submarine warfare. The rescue of the Rakuyo Maru survivors, culminating the 10th patrol, added a profound humanitarian chapter to the war record. The 14 men they pulled from the sea were a living, breathing contradiction to the impersonal horror of maritime combat. When Barb finally surfaced in Fremantle Harbor, not only were there the expected accolades for sinking the Unyo, but the sight of the frail, recovering Allied POWs stepping onto solid ground transformed the crew from lethal warriors into heroes of rescue. Fluckey, later awarded the Medal of Honor for his cumulative heroism and leadership, exemplified the aggressive, relentless spirit of the U.S. submarine fleet. The Barb was a machine, but the men inside her, from the commander who mastered the periscope to the cook who fed the crew and the rescued alike, embodied the true purpose of their service: to fight with skill, survive with resilience, and when the chance arose, to extend a hand of salvation across the deadly waters of the Pacific. Barb was more than a sub. She was an icon of American naval power. Her story etched forever in the annals of World War II history, defined by fire, depth charges, and the improbable rescue that proved humanity could survive even the harshest crucible of war.